No one noticed the girl in the linen veil as she stepped off the sand-slick barge into the southern outpost of Meret Kai. They saw her robes, clean and pale, marked with the symbol of the temple. They saw her downturned eyes and assumed she was there to serve. But Nephira wasn't sent to heal. She was sent to uncover. She was the high priest's hidden knife, trained in silence, wrapped in obedience, and dispatched south to infiltrate the rebels' camp. His name was Qasim, a former commander turned traitor, a ghost who now led a band of desert exiles preaching freedom from the temple's grip. They said he'd stolen scrolls, slaughtered guards, burned prayer houses. Her mission was simple: get close, gain his trust, uncover the names of his followers, then disappear. The priest had made his threat clear. "Return empty-handed," he had said, "and your tongue will decorate my altar." That was 3 weeks ago. Now, as she stood in the shade of a ruined column, watching the rebels repair clay houses and distribute stolen grain to the hungry, Nephira struggled to find the villain she had been promised. Qasim was not what she expected. He didn't wear gold or bark orders. He carried bricks. He knelt to wash wounds. He smiled at children and stared long at the horizon as if still fighting something far beyond it. When they met, he didn't question her made-up name. "You can call yourself whatever you need to," he'd said. "We've all had to." At night she watched him by the fire, reading poetry from scraps of torn scrolls. Her heart should have been a wall, but it listened. On the 12th night, he asked her why her hands trembled when she held a clay bowl. She said it was the cold. He didn't believe her, but he didn't push. And that was the moment it began. Not love, not yet, but the soft cracking of everything she had been trained to be. She still had the list hidden in her robe. Names she had gathered through careful whispers and midnight listening. She could leave tonight, deliver it, earn her way back to silence and survival. But something in her burned. And it wasn't just the desert heat. It was the way Qasim looked at the sky like it might one day break. It was the way he hadn't asked anything from her, and somehow given everything. And it was the terrible, beautiful question beginning to form in her mind. What if I've been spying on the wrong side? By the time Nephira reached her 14th day among the rebels, she had memorized everything the high priest wanted. How many soldiers, how they moved, where they slept, what symbols marked their tents. Her scroll, written in invisible ink, was nearly complete. One last name, one last piece of intel, and she would vanish into the dunes before dawn. The plan was perfect, but her heart was not. That morning, she watched Qasim lift a child out of a broken well, his arms bloodied from stone cuts, his voice calm even as the boy sobbed. No commander would have done that. No traitor either. She found herself walking toward him after dark, the parchment still tucked beneath her robe. "Why do you fight them?" she asked. "The temple, the pharaoh." Qasim didn't look at her right away. He stared into the fire. "Because I gave them 20 years. I wore their armor, killed for their silence, and then they killed my brother, for asking why a farmer was whipped to death for praying in the wrong dialect." His jaw tightened. "They don't want peace. They want obedience disguised as devotion." She said nothing. She couldn't, because she had been sent for obedience too. But that night she burned her scroll, not with ceremony, just quietly. Folded it into the coals while Qasim slept until it crumbled into black curls. Her fingers trembled as the names disappeared in flame. She had crossed a line, one the high priest had warned her never to imagine, let alone touch. The next morning a caravan arrived bearing medicine and grain. With it came a man she recognized too well. Senet, the high priest's eyes in the south. He didn't recognize her at first, but his gaze lingered too long. "You look familiar," he said as they passed near the water tent. "Have you ever served in the House of Silence?" She lowered her eyes. "I scrubbed floors once." Senet didn't press, but the heat of danger thickened. Qasim noticed it too. That night, as they walked the perimeter together, he said, "There's something in your silence, like a scream waiting to happen." Nephira stopped walking. The stars burned cold overhead. "What if I wasn't who you thought?" she asked. Would you hate me for it? Qasim looked at her, soft but certain. Depends. Are you still the one standing here? She didn't answer with words. She touched his hand, lightly, like prayer. And for the first time in her life, she didn't flinch. But somewhere in the shadows, Sennet was watching. And the fire Nefira had started in her heart was now burning far beyond what she could control. Sennet didn't need confirmation. He saw it in her eyes. That flicker of hesitation, that softness no true spy carried. Back in the temple, he had trained alongside Nefira, watched her survive starvation, silenced drills, and days locked in darkness until she could repeat whole passages backward without blinking. She had been the high priest's quietest blade. But now, she glowed. He followed her movements for 3 days, saw how her steps no longer avoided attention, how she paused when Qasim spoke, not to calculate, but to feel. That night, he wrote a scroll and sealed it with the ring of the House of Silence. Then he left without a word, slipping into the wind like a curse made of breath. Nefira sensed it. Something had shifted. Qasim noticed too. You don't sleep anymore, he said quietly. I've forgotten how, she replied. But it wasn't insomnia. It was fear. Not of death, but of breaking something that finally felt real. On the 4th night, as Qasim sat at the edge of the encampment watching smoke rise from cooking fires, she told him everything. Not in a burst, not with tears, but slowly, like peeling away the skin of a fruit she was afraid to taste. They sent me to destroy you, she said. The names, the maps, the rhythms of your breath. I was supposed to report it all. Qasim didn't move, didn't even blink. Why are you still here? She looked down at her hands. Because you never asked anything of me, and that made me want to give you everything. He turned to face her fully now. So what do we do? She breathed, the firelight flickering between them. We run, but he shook his head. If we run, they'll follow and crush the ones who can't move. I stay. Her voice cracked. Then I stay too. Qasim touched her cheek, his calloused thumb wiping away a tear that startled her as much as it did him. You don't owe me that, he said. I do, she whispered, because you made me feel like a person, not a weapon. They kissed then, not desperate but deep, like the slow kindling of something sacred. And in that kiss, Nefira felt her old self shatter. But in the distance, a flare shot into the sky. Red, sharp, undeniable. The priesthood had her signal. The trap was set. Not because she betrayed them, but because someone else had read her heart before she'd known how to hide it. The time for whispers was over. The storm had begun. The red flare lit the sky like blood spilled across the stars. And in its light, Nefira knew her past had caught up. Qasim stood slowly, his eyes searching hers, not for truth, but for readiness. You need to run, he said. I won't let you fall with me. But she didn't move. You're not the one who brought this danger. I am, and I won't run from what I started. Around them, the camp stirred with whispers. Exiles and warriors grabbed blades and slings, unsure whether to fight or flee. Nefira stepped into the center and raised her hands. Listen to me, she called out. I was one of them, a shadow trained to follow orders, to break resistance from the inside. But I broke myself instead. Murmurs grew. A few stepped forward, uncertain. Why should we trust you? Someone shouted. Because I burned the scroll, she said. Because I chose you over survival. Then she turned to Qasim, voice low. Let me do what I was trained for, just not how they meant it. That night the wind shifted. Temple forces moved through the outer dunes, led by Sennet, carrying a writ of judgment sealed in black wax. Capture her alive, he ordered. Kill the rebel if you must, but her voice must be caged. Nefira knew how they'd approach, silent, at dawn, just as campfires die. She had taught them the method. Now she rewrote the defense. Under her direction, the rebels dug trenches, positioned watchers, and turned hollowed date palms into lookout towers. Qasim watched her work with a mixture of awe and pain. You were meant to destroy us, he said. And yet here you are, building something that might stand. She met his gaze, firm. You made me believe I could be more than the blade in someone else's hand. Before dawn, she and Qasim stood at the edge of the valley, watching the moon fade. When they come, he said, they'll call you traitor, heretic, liar. Let them, she answered, because I'm done hiding from names that never fit. He reached for her hand. If we fall together. No, she said softly, we rise. And when the first line of soldiers crested the hill, she stepped forward, not with a weapon, but with her voice. I know every one of you, she called. I trained beside you, I bled beside you, and now I stand against you, not because I hate you, but because I remember who I am. And for a moment, even the wind held its breath, as the girl they'd once sent to destroy became the one thing they couldn't silence. The temple soldiers didn't charge at first. They stood at the ridge, blades drawn but unsure, because Nefira's voice didn't tremble, and because some of them remembered her, remembered how she'd trained blindfolded, how she could strike a falling leaf in the dark. And now she stood with rebels, unarmed, speaking their names aloud. Ramesu, she called, locking eyes with a soldier whose grip faltered. You swore once to protect the innocent. Akif, she said to another, you cried when your sister was taken by temple collectors. You remember what this system does. Qasim stepped beside her, not to lead, but to stand equal. You follow orders written in blood, he shouted, while we live by choice. The soldiers tensed, but still, they didn't move. Senate arrived moments later, his expression twisted with fury. Hold your ground, he barked. She is a liar, a traitor. She desecrated the god's will. Nefira took a step forward. I was your tool, she said, her voice calm but cutting. Until I saw the ones we called sinners feeding the hungry, healing the sick, risking their lives for strangers. You fear me not because I lied, but because I stopped lying for you. Senate's face went pale. He unsheathed his dagger and pointed it at her heart. You'll die for this, he growled. But before he could lunge, a soldier behind him spoke. No, Ramesu said. We followed silence too long. One by one, others stepped back. Akif dropped his spear. 3 more turned. In the stillness, Qasim whispered, They're choosing. Not me, Nefira replied. Themselves. Senate screamed and charged. Too fast, too wild. Qasim moved to protect her, but he didn't need to. Nefira stepped aside, pivoted, and with one fluid motion, twisted Senate's arm and sent his blade clattering to the ground. You taught me how to fight, she said, standing over him, but not how to fear you. She walked away, leaving him on his knees. No one helped him up. The soldiers who remained simply watched in stunned silence as she returned to the camp. That night, fires burned bright, not for battle, but for rebirth. Nefira sat beside Qasim, her fingers entwined with his. You could have killed him, he said. That's what they expected. She looked at the stars. They cut our tongues to stop us from singing, she murmured. But tonight, the silence sang back. And somewhere beyond the dunes, in a city still clinging to control, the high priest felt a tremor run through his prayers, because he knew his perfect weapon had found a new voice, and it was no longer his. By the time word reached the capital, it was too late to contain it. A spy had defected. A rebel commander lived. And worse, soldiers had chosen mercy over obedience. The high priest held court with clenched fists, his voice breaking through incense smoke and trembling scribes. She was shaped to serve, he hissed, to obey, to report, not to sing. He spat the last word like a curse. But in the southern lands, the people were singing. Not loud, not in chorus, but in murmurs that moved faster than the scrolls could be burned. In villages where temple statues once towered, farmers scratched Nefira's name into the base of broken idols. Girls whispered her story to one another beneath starlit roofs. And in the camp, free of bloodshed but thick with change, Nefira stood uncertain. I didn't mean for this, she said to Qasim. I only meant to survive. He smiled gently. But you did more. You made others want to survive too. And that was the problem. With each whisper, the temple's grip weakened. The high priest didn't send another army. He sent a decree. Nephira is to be brought back, not for death, but for reconditioning. They would not make her a martyr. They would silence her in private, behind closed temple walls, until she became obedient again. Nephira laughed when she heard. They still think I'm a blade they can hammer back into shape. Qasim frowned. If you go, they'll never let you speak again. Then I won't go, she replied. But I will walk straight to the edge of their world and sing. Days later, she stood at the base of a ruined temple outside Thebes. Dozens had gathered. Not a rebellion, not a riot, just people. Some holding children, some holding silence, all holding hope. Nephira climbed the crumbled stairs once meant only for high priests and royalty, and then she sang. Not loudly, not with force, but with memory. A song her mother had once hummed before being taken into the House of Silence. A song forbidden in temples, dismissed as peasant superstition. It filled the air like a prayer that belonged to no god, only to people. When she finished, no one clapped. They stood, eyes glassed, as if remembering something they hadn't realized they'd lost. Qasim stood below her, hands clasped behind his back, watching not a spy, not a weapon, but a woman who had undone an empire with the gentlest rebellion of all, a voice they had tried to erase, now echoing across their broken walls. The high priest sent his final warning on papyrus dyed black, stamped in crimson wax with the seal of absolute judgment. Return the girl or face divine retribution. But no divine hand came. No flame fell from the sky. Only more people arrived. Pilgrims not to worship, but to listen. They didn't bring offerings. They brought stories. Women with scars. Men who had lost brothers. Children born under names forbidden in temple scrolls. They came to Nephira not for salvation, but to remember how to be human. You've become the temple, Qasim whispered to her one night. One without walls. She didn't know what to say. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She only wanted to live without lying. But symbols are born the moment truth survives a blade. On the outskirts of the city, where cracked shrines lined a dried-up river, a procession marched quietly. Cloaked priests sent to capture her. They did not raise swords. They came with chains and parchment, believing she would kneel once shown the law. Nephira met them halfway, alone, beneath a broken statue of the goddess Ma'at. You come for obedience, she said, but what I gave you was never loyalty. It was fear. One priest stepped forward. If you return, you will be spared. And what will I be? She asked. A tool again? A hollow name in your scrolls? He faltered. You are sacred. She laughed, sharp, clean. Then why did you train me to listen but never speak? They said nothing, because they didn't have to. She had already won. Not with a sword, not with poison, but with voice. And that was more dangerous than any weapon they could forge. The priests left empty-handed. That night, Nephira and Qasim sat on the temple steps, sharing roasted dates and wine. The stars above were quieter than usual, as if even the heavens waited. They won't stop, Qasim said. They'll rewrite scrolls, send lies, find new girls. Then I'll teach the new girls to remember their names before the silence steals them. Nephira replied, I'll keep singing. He turned to her, the fire reflecting in his eyes. And if they cut out your voice, she touched his chest, then you speak, and when they cut yours, someone else will, because voices aren't born in temples, they're born in pain that refuses to stay quiet. Far below the temple, the cities pulsed with a restless silence. But at the edge of that world, Nephira sang again, not for glory, but for the ones still listening from the shadows, waiting for someone to teach them how. The temple's final attempt wasn't war, it was erasure. Scribes were commanded to rewrite every record that named her. Scrolls were cleansed, paintings repainted. In temples, her face was forbidden to be spoken. There is no Nephira, they declared. There never was. But truth doesn't need ink to survive. It lives in eyes that remember and lips that dare repeat what was meant to be silenced. Across the Nile, traders passed her name in broken verses. A potter etched her silhouette into clay jars, and a dying priest, once her tutor, confessed to villagers before his last breath. She lived. And she sang. Nephira didn't revel in the growing legend. She didn't build shrines or claim holiness. She spent her days teaching little girls how to read the sky before they read a scripture, how to speak their names without bowing. And Qasim, her rebel-turned protector, stood beside her, building homes, not armies. "You've changed the world," he told her once. She smiled faintly. "No, I just refused to let it change me." But the world had changed. The people had begun to ask questions. Why must silence mean faith? Why must pain mean purification? And what kind of gods fear the sound of a girl's voice? The high priest died quietly, alone in his marble chamber, choking not on poison or age, but on the weight of a world slipping from his grasp. No procession mourned him. No statue was raised. And in the square below, a group of children sang a song Nephira had once taught them, a lullaby lost to the temple centuries ago. One day, an elder from the capital visited her. He had once watched her train with knives. Now he knelt at her feet. "How did you do it?" he asked. "We broke stronger ones than you." Nephira looked at the horizon. "Because you broke bodies," she said, "but not belief. You forgot that truth isn't housed in scrolls. It lives in every woman you try to erase." The elder wept then, not from shame, but relief. Someone had finally said it. Nephira stood that evening on a stone ledge and told her story one last time, not for fame, but so the girls standing in the crowd would grow up knowing they were not born to be obedient. They were born to remember, to question, to sing. And that night, as the wind swept her words across the valley, even the gods, those made by fear and sustained by silence, trembled a little, because the voice they had tried to crush had grown too wide for scrolls, and too deep for forgetting. Years passed, but her voice didn't fade. It multiplied. It lived in the marketplaces where women now bartered without lowering their eyes. It echoed in the quiet resolve of daughters who learned to ask why before how. It hummed in the soft songs sung by mothers who once feared their own tongues. Nephira didn't become a queen or a priestess or a legend carved in gold. She became something greater, a memory no one could control. She and Qasim built a small home near the edge of the river, where reeds grew tall and boats slowed to listen. Travelers came not to worship, but to sit by her fire. They brought questions, tears, and sometimes silence. She never turned them away. "They'll forget me one day," she said once as she stitched a torn tunic by the fire. "And that's all right." Qasim looked up from carving a tool. "They'll forget the stories," he said, "but not the strength they gave." She nodded. "Then I've done enough." But the world hadn't forgotten. Not really. Scribes in distant villages began recording tales that temple law had once forbidden. One scroll read simply, "She taught us the sound of survival." Another, "She made rebels out of silence." And in the rebuilt ruins of the temple where she had first sung, someone carved a line in stone where an idol used to stand. A woman once stood here. She taught us not to bow. Nephira aged. Her hands wrinkled, her steps slowed. But her voice, low and warm, remained. It didn't preach, it didn't command, it invited. And that was its power. One day, a child came to her alone. His mother had died birthing him. His father had vanished into temple debt. He asked her, "Were you ever afraid?" She looked at him and said, "Every moment, but fear is where you meet your voice." He sat at her feet, and she taught him the same song they had tried to cut from her tongue. His voice cracked and trembled, but he sang, loudly, proudly. And when he finished, the birds nearby took flight, not startled, but stirred. That evening, Qasim lit the fire while Nephira watched the sun lower behind the palms. "If I hadn't spoken," she said softly, "I wouldn't have found you." He smiled. "You didn't just find me," he replied. "You found yourself, and you let the world listen." She took his hand and held it to her chest. "Then promise me one thing," she whispered. "When I'm gone, Don't let them sing alone. And as the stars returned, the river whispered her name, not because it had to, but because it wanted to. When Nephira passed, no bells rang in the capital, no royal mourning rites, no priestly wails or gilded tombs. But across the river, at the edge of the reeds where her fire once burned, hundreds gathered. They brought no offerings, only stories. A girl carried a tablet etched with the words, "She gave me my voice." An old soldier stood silently, tears cutting lines through sun-worn cheeks. A priest, one who had defected long ago, read a scroll she had once torn in half. And Qasim, he didn't speak. He simply held her scarf, worn thin by time, and watched the sky as if listening for her final breath in the wind. They laid her not in a tomb, but beneath a fig tree grown from the same grove where she had once buried the last scroll she ever wrote. Her grave had no name, no statue, but the people knew. They came to sit in silence, to feel the echo she left behind, not in the ground, but in themselves. For weeks, nothing changed, and then, suddenly, everything did. The temple in the north, where she had once trained as a spy, was emptied. Its head priest found alone, his words lost, his scrolls unopened. No one feared his curses anymore. His silence, once feared, was now seen for what it truly was: emptiness. In villages far from stone roads, songs she once sang bloomed in fields, carried by girls who refused to bow. Markets once hushed by temple guards now buzzed with debate, with poetry, with laughter. The voice they tried to cut had become everyone's. Kings came and fell. New gods were carved into stone. But Nephira's story slipped into everything, quiet as dusk, strong as dawn. One day, a temple scholar wandered into a village and asked a child, "Who taught you to speak that way?" The girl smiled, her voice clear and steady. "A woman," she said. "Her name was—" But she stopped. She didn't need to say it. The wind already had. Back at the river's edge, Qasim returned year after year, sitting beneath her tree with children who never knew her, but lived because of her. He told them of the time she turned down a kingdom just to hear her own voice, of the day she faced blades with only breath, of the night she taught him that love isn't in promises, but in presence. And when he finally joined her, years later, they buried him beside her. No marker, just two graves beneath the wind, two echoes too wide for silence, and the world, forever changed, whispered back in every language. She lived, she loved, she sang, and we remember.